Hello class. Alright, for this week we're going to go over the founding of the United States and the Constitution. Here's our founding fathers right there. George Washington in the center. So, just a real quick point about these founders who are going to lead the United States into a successful revolutionary war against the greatest power at the time, the British government. That these people had strong philosophical beliefs about the type of government they wanted, about liberty, individual freedom. But they also were human beings with pragmatic interests, things that they wanted in terms of wealth, land. These are people who are, kind of like our politicians today. So at least have that in mind. The text breaks into the groups at the time: New England merchants, Southern planters. These are the elite royalists who still believe we should stay with Britain, and more of the middle, lower class, shopkeepers and laborers and small farmers. So it's important to know that, for a long time the United States was a British colony, but we had royal governors in charge, but there was a fair amount of autonomy, meaning the United States, the colonists, had a fair amount of say in how things were run in their societies and towns and states. But this was seen to be eroding in the 1760s and 1770s by laws passed in Britain that were putting more restrictions on American commercialism, trade, taxes on important exports and imports into the American colonies. And the American people were becoming increasingly rebellious. And this went from the top to the bottom in terms of classes. The merchants and planters started to listen to more of the radical elements of their colonial society, wanting more independence. And obviously, this is an important topic that we can go on and on with, and there are so many great books, and I'll definitely recommend some. But just some of the main key events that spurred the United States to decide to leave Britain and actually start a war for freedom and declare independence. These are some of the main markers: the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, which was against the Tea Act, Intolerable Acts, which were to punish Massachusetts people for the acts when they did the Boston Tea Party, and then them getting together to First Continental and Second Continental Congress, which would make the Articles of Confederation, and the fighting starting, bullets flying in Lexington and Concord. And here as we talked about last week, that this is a collective action principle. Citizens in the United States, colonists, were getting together to make a political movement. The Declaration of Independence, which I have linked right there, is a revolutionary document. Here we have a world where there's always autocratic governments everywhere you look. And you have this document from these colonists saying the legitimacy of the government is because of the consent of the people governed by that government, not top down via the king or God. This comes from the people. They give the government legitimacy. And that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they're not given by any government, but they're given by God. Every person born has that ability and right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, the revolutionary part where Britain's concerned is that this says that when a government no longer serves its people, the people have a right to revolt. Which, of course, they did in the Revolutionary War, which we're not going to get into, but several years long, the U.S. outlasts the British, thanks to, of course, the leader, George Washington here. This is the crossing of the Delaware, famous painting, the Battle of Trenton, on Christmas Day and the day after Christmas. So at the time of the Revolutionary War and for several years after successfully defeating the British, the U.S. are governed by the Articles of Confederation. This is just really a loose arrangement of the 13 colonies, 13 states. There is no president. It's just all 13 states needed to decide unanimously to get anything done. There's no ability to tax, no ability to get an army, build an army, pay for an army. You read the books about the Revolution, there's constant issues with George Washington asking for more troops, more money, and the Confederation government is pretty much useless. Then at this time here, we're talking the 1780s, there was a rebellion in Massachusetts led by Daniel Shays, where these poor farmers were having their land taken away due to foreclosures of debt, some of it being war debt, when they were all fighting for the Revolutionary War. So this rebellion, which had to be put down by local militia, was definitely on the minds of the founding fathers when they started to get together and say, hey, we need to make a document that is more stronger, more powerful than the Articles of Confederation. So the founders, had to make some big decisions. They got together in Annapolis and decided, hey, we're going to do a big constitutional convention, get together in Philadelphia and, talk about whether we should revise Articles of Confederation or could scrap them entirely. And this was not even known at the time when people came. They were led by James Madison. They were going to debate, state power versus national power. Yes, we wanted democracy. We are gone with the king, done with autocrats, but there's levels of democracy. How much democracy do we want? And of course, the slavery still existed, and that would be a major issue. And real quick, I'm going to go over two of the big compromises that happened. The Great Compromise. This is where the small states, think of Delaware, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and the large states, Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, where they had to make a decision about what kind of representation. And through this compromise, you would have a legislature with a House of Representatives that would be based on population for the big states, and a Senate which would be based on just every state has the same number of representatives, 2, no matter how big, no matter how small. And the 3/5 compromise, of course, this is where the slave states got to count 3/5 of their slave population towards their political representation. So the convention produced a constitution with 7 articles, which we'll discuss. The first 3 cover the 3 main branches that would be the government and represent how we are represented, the people represented, and the checks and balances between them. The legislative branch, this is article number 1, this is supposed to be the most powerful branch in government. As I mentioned, it's bicameral. This is where there's 2 houses, 2 chambers. There's express powers. They list exactly what the legislator can do, what kind of laws they can make, what they're responsible for, taxing, spending. And there's also the necessary proper clause, which gives a little bit of elastic to the express powers, saying, the U.S. legislator can make whatever laws are necessary and proper to carry out their express powers. The second article, of course, creates the presidency, the executive branch. It was discussed how to make this 1, 2, 3 people, and they put it into wanting to be one strong, independent person. Of course, the president would be commander-in-chief, the chief executive, and chief diplomat. They could veto legislation, but of course, the legislator is the most powerful part of the government, so they could override that veto. And they also nominate judges and grant pardons. Article 3 is the judicial branch. It provides for a Supreme Court and says Congress can establish all lower courts. So all you're going to read in the Constitution is about the Supreme Court, and that the judges will be appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. And here we can see these checks and balances. Judicial review we'll discuss in coming weeks. Some of the other articles, Article 4 just lays out that states laws in different states, you can't have any laws that discriminate against other states. So this is the idea of making one big country with separate states, but that there's full faith and credit and privileges and immunities. These all are fair between states. And there's a supremacy clause in Article 6, which will say that the federal government policy is supreme over the state policy. Article 5 of the Constitution describes how you can amend the Constitution, how you can change it, add to it. This is extremely difficult, and it was made to be extremely difficult. Pretty much you need 2/3 of the House and Senate to approve of something, and then 3/4 of all state legislatures to also approve it. This was meant to be difficult, and it has been. Only 27 amendments. Article 7 talked about ratifying, how the Constitution would be ratified. So we have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists debating, what do we want to support this Constitution? Federalists are in favor of the Constitution. They support this stronger national government instead of the Articles of Confederation. The Anti-Federalists were concerned. They were concerned that this government would be too powerful. We just were under a monarchy, an autocratic government, and they feared that this was too much power for the federal government and the monarchy could come back. So the Anti-Federalists wanted more representatives, more direct democracy, and the Federalists wanted more centralized control, less local control. The Federalists, James Madison, persuasively in the end argued against the tyranny of a majority. This chart breaks down the difference between Anti-Federalists and Federalists, and we're going to go into this tyranny of the majority here. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay wrote dozens of papers, articles defending the Constitution, pushing for ratification, and some of these papers are now considered pretty much an addendum to the Constitution, including Federalist 10, which James Madison breaks down why we should support the Constitution, because it will help protect against factionalism and instability, which is a key problem for democracy. He's very democratic, wants liberty, but he wants a democracy that will work. And he worries about these factions, these groups of people getting together and all of a sudden not supporting the Constitution anymore, or just over maybe a religious zeal or some kind of short-term change that pushes the government in the wrong direction. So he says, we need to filter out public opinion via these representatives. We are a republic democracy, not just a democracy. We have representatives who hopefully are able to filter out the public opinion, take the good part, not the bad part. He also wants to extend the sphere. This is where, because of the U.S. size, it's actually a positive. We have interests from Massachusetts, representatives from Georgia, representatives from Delaware. These will hopefully keep one faction from taking over. A minority faction is much less threatening to our republic than a majority faction. They design the government, separation of powers. The president is checked by the Congress. The judiciary is appointed by the president and approved by Congress. There are checks and balances. Power is separated. This will keep the faction from taking over. I'm thinking of the idea of if a president gets tyrannical, the Congress can impeach him. The judiciary could say his laws or Congress's laws are unconstitutional. So James Madison is arguing that this Constitution will protect the states and individuals from abuse of national government. And just going over this all one more time about how the separation of powers, the federalism, powers to the states, powers to the central government, and the Bill of Rights, which was, of course, passed right after the Constitution, ensures the rights and liberties of the states. We are a government with limits. And here is the Bill of Rights. So, thank you, class. I will see you on the discussion board.